What's the most eerie, unsettling thing you've ever encountered while hiking or in the woods? The walking things that follow you. Almost every day, my friend and I used to walk in the woods by his place. When walking, we'd hear the sound of footsteps alongside us, behind us, ahead of us, all around. It sounded like people walking in the woods. If we stopped walking, the sound of steps would stop. If one of us walked and the other stood still, there was no sound of footsteps. We had to both walk. This went on for years. We'd stand still and look everywhere and see nothing. Nothing but the trees. Take a few steps and we'd immediately hear people walking all around us. One day we were walking down the road instead of in the woods, and we heard the same noise of footsteps from the woods. We looked into the woods and there was a little tiny bird. It was hopping in the leaves at exactly human walking pace. 2 years of worry for a 4-inch tall hopping bird. They didn't live in my woods, but they were all over his. It was nice to solve a problem with a happy ending. Grew up living in rural Arkansas. I lived right on the edge of town at one point, and a buddy's house was a few miles away. Quickest way to get there was to walk along the train tracks. So I'm walking to his house one night, and it's dark. Like, dark. Wasn't a moon out, and there's nothing on either side for a good while but dense woods. It's not unusual to hear things running around, and for the most part, they're harmless. But when it's pitch black and the middle of the night, you don't think harmless. I'm crunching along on the gravel when I hear something crashing through the woods off to my left. I stop walking to listen, and it stops after a second. I start walking along and something starts rushing through the brush, and I hear it crunch through the gravel right in front of me and stop what sounds like a few feet away. I froze, and I'm just trying to see anything when I hear a loud snort, and it crunches off into the woods again. An hour later, while I'm sitting in a house with lights on everywhere, I thought about how I wish it was daylight so I could see how close the deer came to me. At the time it happened, all I could think was, this is it. This is how I die. Some horrible monster is about to drag me into the woods and eat me. My little brother and I were tossing a baseball around near dusk at the bottom of our property. 30 wooded mountain acres way in the middle of nowhere. It had gotten dark enough that we were just about to call it quits when we heard the single most horrifying scream we've ever heard, before or since, from the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. Imagine a woman screaming in mortal agony, writhing in the most wretched torment imaginable. Every tortured scream from horror movies, war movies, anything you've ever heard. Nothing compared to this. Even now, decades removed from hearing it, the hair on my arms and neck stands up just thinking of it, and it's made even worse by the realization of what it actually was. A mountain lion. Full-grown female mountain lions scream loudly when they're in heat, and it sounds like a human woman being torn to pieces by the devil himself. To hear that, 2 kids alone in the dark in the middle of nowhere, was about as terrifying as it gets. Back when I was younger, I did some survey work for a logging company in Alaska. As I was fit and liked to hike, they sent me in first to check out the terrain and figure out the best ways into the area they wanted to harvest. I always traveled light, just a backpack with a US Army mess kit, some MREs, a few spare clothes, a fire kit, a bivouac sack, an axe, a knife, some bear spray, and a revolver. I also used to cut me a nice thick hiking stick. With all that gear packed, I set out on foot. The first night was largely quiet, and I got a good night's sleep. Only one time I woke up to what I thought was the wind rustling through the trees, and I didn't think much of it. The next day I arrived at the designated logging area and started to do my work. Around noon I started to get that eerie feeling of being watched. I had had this feeling before, but I always blamed my imagination for it. Well, it grew more and more over the day. Right when I was about to set up camp for the night, I heard some rustling in the brush again, and caught a glimpse of something big huddling out of sight. Needless to say, I skipped setting up the camp and booked it out of there. I walked about 10 miles until I was too tired to move on. The feeling of being watched had stopped, and I deemed it safe to set up my camp. I woke up in the morning, and the first thing I saw were bear tracks of what I think was a huge grizzly going all over my campsite. I have never broken up the camp this fast again. I made sure my revolver was loaded and within arm's reach at all times, and kept my bear spray at the ready on the way back. But nothing happened anymore. I told the logging company about my encounter, and they said they will take the necessary precautions. A few months later, when the logging operation was in full swing, a worker was attacked and killed by what was later described as a huge male grizzly bear. A year or so later, hunters in that area shot one of the biggest grizzlies I have ever seen, and judging by the size of its paws, it could have been that very bear stalking me on that hike. One day, my girlfriend and brother and I were on our way to a dog shelter in a rural area where we wanted to go play and interact with their rescues and drop off some donations. So we get kinda lost and start down a dirt road leading into the woods. We don't know the area at all, and it's midday, so the sun is out, and there are no people around, so the drive is pretty, and we're just joking and laughing and enjoying the scenery. As we round a bend in the road, we see an old house with an unkempt lawn and some broken cars out front, but no obvious signs of people living there. We're still in a good mood and making jokes about the hills have eyes vibe the house is giving off, but we decide it's best to turn around, as the shelter is clearly not on this road. I follow the road another 10 meters or so to get to a clearing behind the house so I can turn around, and as we drive past the backyard, we can see the whole yard is full of mannequins. Old, sun-damaged mannequins in all shapes and sizes, some with clothing, but most just naked and broken. I cannot describe how incredibly unsettling this was. There had to be over 50 of them, some without heads, some with only partial heads, and most of them had limbs missing. Some were propped up into strange but very specific positions that had to be done by someone deliberately, and some of them just laying about like they were clearly just dropped there ages ago and never touched again. Just a whole yard full of disfigured mannequins in the middle of the woods. Everyone in the car went dead quiet right away, and all the joking stopped immediately. I locked the doors and rolled up the windows and started to turn the car around. I told my brother to keep an eye on the house and my girlfriend to keep an eye on the woods to make sure no one was near. Just as I turned around, my brother says, "Someone's looking at us through the curtains." I think that was the single most frightening moment of my life. As we passed the house, the door opened, and a middle-aged lady comes out and starts walking toward us. She walked right up to the road, and as we approached her with the car, she seemed quite friendly and gestured for us to stop and roll down our windows, which I actually did. It turns out lots of people get lost there looking for the animal shelter, and she very politely gave us the directions. We thanked her and followed her directions, which turned out to be correct. She's just a lady who lives in the woods and collects mannequins. Scared us shitless though, and I still get the creeps when I walk into a store that has dolls. In August of 2019, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles around the US. I often preferred to just disappear into the woods at night, camping somewhere people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. After a month of this, I had grown quite accustomed to the sounds of a forest at night. The constant droning of crickets and toads became a comfort to me, and it was always a highlight of the night, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the yips and howls of distant coyotes. One of my favorite moments of the whole trip was the night spent camping right between 2 owls, who hooted back and forth through much of the night. Then there was one September night in Montana. There were no crickets or toads, nor coyotes or owls. There wasn't even the babbling of a nearby creek, or a breeze through the dry leaves of early autumn still clinging to the trees. It was completely silent. During those 7 months, I learned to sleep through a lot. There was a night I set up camp just 10 feet away from some very active train tracks. In one night at a hostel, I had a roommate who loudly snored and a bunkmate who talked in his sleep. I pitched my tent in a Walmart parking lot, and I spent a night in the tent with food poisoning, occasionally vomiting out the door of the tent. But that night, in the silent forest of Montana, was the worst night's sleep out of the 179 nights. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever heard. The occasional snapping of a twig, or similar sounds that would normally get lost in the cacophony of the forest, on that night, sounded as loud as those freight trains, and it felt as if the entire forest was trying to hide from an equally silent predator. It was incredibly unnerving, and the next morning, I could not get out of there soon enough. In high school, some friends and I would often cruise the back roads of our small town and break into abandoned houses and use our video camera to capture ghost videos. One night, we drove by a very deep ravine that was dried up, and the ground around it was covered in leaves. I said we should check it out and see who would go the furthest into the ravine. 3 of us went in, and the other 3 stayed behind, saying it was way too scary to check out. While we were walking, we saw an empty gallon jug, then came across a piece of blue clothing, then some other trash. We didn't have the flashlight on to add to the effect, we just turned it on every now and then to see things better. The moon was full, but it was very hard to see because of all the tree coverage. Suddenly a cold chill ran down my back, and I felt like we weren't alone. I froze. My friends stopped immediately with me. I know they felt what I felt. We could hear a rush of branches breaking and leaves crunching. It was all around us at the top of the ravine. My friend shined his light, and we could see people rushing all around us. We turned around and ran back the way we came, back into darkness. I'm so amazed none of us fell. We got to the car and started pounding on it. We jumped in and I got into the driver's seat, and we floored it out of there. We were deep in the woods, about 20 miles from town, but rushed home with all of us talking at once. We have been warned before by authorities to stay out of the woods, that terrible things happen there, but we didn't listen. Things could have ended much differently for us. We're lucky we made it back home. My buddy and I were riding bikes out to meet some friends who had already set up to camp outside of town. We had to work late, so we didn't hit the trail until after the sun was already going down. But we had some lights on and a pretty good view of the trail ahead for the speed we were riding. Even though it's summer, there weren't really any other trail users this time at night, so I was a little startled to see a figure catch the light as we moved along. As we got closer, this figure seemed less familiar, less human. After a few more moments, my headlight illuminated a shriveled, fleshy, puppet-like thing jerking around about 250 feet away, skinny and pale and featureless. I didn't really have any time to react, so I just kept riding. I figured if it was a wild animal, I'd be better off moving than standing still anyway. At this moment, we also recognized that its startling puppet-like movement was in fact just an awkward, jerking gait. This thing was running straight towards us at a decent pace. We had no time to strategize. We just held our line as this pale, bony nightmare grew even closer. A moment later, the image finally resolved in the cold light of our portable LEDs. A completely nude, hairless jogger in the night. He passed us by wordlessly, no doubt as surprised as we were to see someone on the trail so late at night. It was such an unexpected encounter that my brain just could not accept the rational possibility, and instead, I nearly caught a heart attack thinking I'd get jumped by a real cryptid that night. My boyfriend and I decided to go for a hike 3 hours away from where we live, in a different state. As the day of the hike grew closer, we noticed that it had a decent chance for stormy weather all day. We took our chances and still left for the hike. Luckily, it was only raining for the first part of the hike, and it didn't rain again until we were leaving to drive home. We went on a trail that was insanely rocky and steep. Looking back, it was probably the worst trail to go on, because everything was wet and slick, but we didn't think about it then. There was a mountain in the middle of the trail. On our way up the mountain, we saw a singular bare footprint. It looked like a human footprint. The dirt was soft and easily imprinted from the rain, so the footprint had to have been from that day. The rain would have washed it away if it wasn't from a few hours prior. You could count 5 toes on it and see the indentions that are compatible of a human foot climbing a steep mountain. No one else was on the trail with us. No one was ahead of us either. The trail was also extremely rocky. Whoever made the footprint could not have gotten up the rocks without shoes. It would have destroyed their feet. I felt like I was being watched before we found the footprint, but I chalked it up to being in the middle of the woods and having animals watching me. Now, I'm wondering if someone could have actually been staring at me. I found human remains while on a walk with a friend. So here's some backstory. Both me and her like taking pictures of abandoned buildings because we're weirdos like that. Well, there's this old abandoned mental hospital from the late 1800s, early 1900s, about 5 hours away from where we live, and we decide to go out there for a weekend. So weekend comes, and since our parents are friends as well, they decide to come along. So we drive like halfway across Virginia and finally get to this place. We're walking around outside and decide to go check out the old graveyard where they buried all the patients, and which was in a wooded area. They also did some pretty messed up experiments on the patients as well, which I think was pretty common for mental hospitals back in the day. Anyway, we're walking along the path in the graveyard, and I noticed something white sticking out of the ground. My mom, former X-ray tech, looks at it, and she's like, "Oh, that looks like a human arm bone." Then I said something like, "Oh, that's, nice?" I wasn't really shocked or scared. I was just thinking, this is a graveyard. Graveyards have bones in them. Rest of the trip was really fun, except for the redneck who yelled at us for pulling over into his property for a second because we were lost. Mine is more unsettling than creepy, I guess, but me and my friend B were walking in this area of woods near his house that had a sign outside of it that said, "The Wetlands, keep out," with a creepy little smiley face underneath it, all in bright red paint. We decided one day out of pure boredom that it was a good idea to go explore it. We walked for about a half a mile when we saw about 15 to 20 deflated balloons hanging on tree branches. We weren't very concerned at first, thinking maybe someone had a party or something out here. However, as we got closer to them, we saw a dark liquid dripping out of about half of them. He was too scared to go any closer, but I walked up to one to get a better look. It looked too dark to be blood, so we had no idea what it was. It did have a slight reddish tint to it, but it was more the color of motor oil. We just stood there for several minutes, wondering why the hell there would be motor oil in a bunch of balloons. As we were standing there, we started hearing the sound of several engines quickly getting closer to us, so we booked it straight the way back to the road. Us being dumb kids also decided that we'd go back there a few days later with some other friends to scare them. But when we went back, there wasn't a single trace of the balloons or the oil. My friend B said that the rain probably just washed them away, to which I agreed, and then quickly realized that the ground was bone dry. Needless to say, we didn't dare go back there. To know if this counts, as I live quite near a wooded area, but I can remember one particular period of time after/during a gaming binge, and it started about maybe 10 p.m., but it started with loud scratching on the walls and eventually on the roof, with loud movement in those areas quite consistently in short bursts, but with no growls of any kind. Now for context, I live in a cabin on my folks' property that has solid walls and no roof cavity, so that would mean it had to be outside regardless. This same series of noises occurred a few times each hour, and continued until 3 a.m. the next morning, when it abruptly stopped. Next morning, about 11 a.m., I checked the exterior, and there was no damage to the walls whatsoever. What makes this story weird is 3 things. 1, I live in Australia, and we don't have any large animals that could do that. 2, my dog in the cabin with me could hear it as well, and seemed worried. 3, we are rural, and have no close neighbors. To this day, I still don't know what it was. I was in the 5th grade. Our school takes 5th graders on a field trip to the Redwoods every year. There's more details about it, but that's not important in this story. We stay up in the Redwoods for multiple nights, 4 in total. One of the nights, our group goes on night hikes. You go in a group with many kids and some adults that were called camp leaders. Usually, the night hikes would start at 11 p.m., so it would get really dark, especially in the woods with enormous redwood trees. Our group was getting ready to go on the hike. Our camp leaders were telling us to stay as quiet as possible so we don't disturb any of the animals such as deer or raccoons that live in the forest. We were also given flashlights that give off not a lot of light, so our eyes can adjust in the dark. A good example of how much light the flashlights gave off would be like a glow-in-the-dark shirt. We start the hike a little bit late, at 11:15, due to an incident that happened in the night apparently. However, we were allowed to start the hike like nothing happened. About halfway through the hike, we hear this very strange noise, something you've probably never heard before. Our camp leaders were definitely concerned, so our group knew something was not right. Keep in mind we were in the middle of one of the deepest forests in America, and it's almost midnight. We had to stay quiet and have only a small amount of light. We heard the sound again. This would be the last time, but it was definitely more threatening. Our group was shocked. We can't run away, we can't use our flashlights, we can't make a lot of noise. It felt like we were held hostage. Luckily, we were able to make it out of the hike as planned, It was about midnight by now, and we were all tired and wanted to get to our cabins for tomorrow. That morning, we were told we had to leave early. We weren't given a reason why, and this was obviously not planned. We left and got back home, and that was the field trip. If I had to guess why we left early, I assumed the incident was whatever was in those woods. I don't know if it was a creature that hasn't been discovered yet, or if it was just an animal making weird noises, but whatever it wasn't human. When I was 16 while I was camping, 2 seasonal people around my age took me into the woods to show me around. We came across an old-looking house that had looked like it was there for several years with no upkeep. It had broken wooden stairs, a front door that looked slanted, broken windows, etc. The seasonals told me that they walk this path, talking about the way they took me through the woods, every year that they come, and that this house had never been there. One of them started to tear up in their eyes, saying that they're freaked the fuck out, and questioning how the hell did a house just appear out of nowhere. Me being 16 and lacking care at the time to be freaked out, thinking that they were just messing with me, I said, let's check it out, but the seasonals said no. Are you crazy? We're leaving. So they turned and began to walk away. I faced them, turned back at the house, and I swear I saw someone pale in the face looking out the window and grinning at me. Now I'm not 100% on that. As a skeptic, it could have been maybe a dirty window, or my eyes playing tricks on me, since it was now becoming darker. But even just typing this comment, I have a chill going down my spine remembering that day. I ended up walking that path again several years later with some cousins of mine, and the house was not there. I can't explain it honestly. Not exactly unexpected, but southern Utah is absolutely littered with ancestral Puebloan ruins. Some of them are little drive-up sites with paved viewpoints. Some of them are cataloged in guidebooks, but some of them you just have to find by looking around very carefully when the hair on the back of your neck starts standing up. The ones highest up in the cliffs were likely built towards the end of the ancestral Puebloans' time in the southwest, before they left due to war and climate change. There's definitely something eerie about a secret ruin from an ancient people that disappeared. The ruins are almost certainly known very thoroughly to archaeologists, but not made public, and the ancestral Puebloans probably moved and became modern Puebloan tribes in New Mexico, but still. There are also allegedly the mummified remains of an ancient individual meditating on top of a cliff, but I've never seen them, and their location is highly protected. The most disturbing thing I ever saw out there was a beautiful petroglyph of a larger-than-life woman painted inside of what was basically a natural cathedral, that the next time I visited had her eyes gouged out by some asshole tourist. Also, disclaimer, please don't wander around the southwest desert with no direction hoping to find ruins. You might find ruins, but you also might find yourself stuck in a slot canyon, or stomping through very delicate ecosystems that take hundreds of years to grow. There's a reason Hollywood uses that landscape to film scenes on alien planets. Well, I think this was definitely the creepiest thing I've ever seen. I was on a DOFE expedition a while back, and we were all starting to get very tired. We noticed it was starting to get dark, so we decided to stray off route and find a quicker way back to the campsite. The way we chose took us through an extremely boggy road. I did DOFE cycling back then, so this kind of stuff was extremely difficult. As we went on, it started pouring down, and we quickly spotted a broken down barn that still had its roof slightly intact. We decided that would be the best place to be and stopped off there to try and wait out the storm. As we were chatting about how crap this experience had been so far, I noticed something to the side of me. It was a door. I know what you're thinking, it's just a door, nothing wrong with it. Well, that's where you're wrong. It seemed out of place with the barn, as it looked refurbished and had a huge padlock on it. The padlock didn't look rusted, no, it looked brand new. I just thought, coincidence maybe, until I looked closer and realized that spray painted on the door was a sign saying free candy. Well, that did it to me, and I told my friend to look. At this point, we got freaked out, so we informed the rest of our group what was happening. However, instead of picking up our bikes and leaving, one of us decided to basically act like he wasn't scared, so he went up to the door and knocked on it 3 times. At this point, Me and my friend were ready to get out of there, and I am never going to forget this. As 3 knocks sounded instantly after the boy knocked, and they weren't short separate knocks. Oh no, they were in a beat. I instantly bolted out of there with my friend and the others not too close behind. But it was definitely the scariest moment of my life. I was on a camping sesh with the lads about a year or so ago. Every summer we go on loads of camping trips. The woods are about a 10 to 15 minute walk from my house, so it's perfect. Close enough to home if something goes wrong, but also far enough away that we can have fun. The woods are divided into 2 sections. There's one side of the woods where we camp, and then an open plain of grass, and then another side of woods. There's nothing in the other side of the woods. Nobody ever goes down there because it's completely pointless. Nowhere to go. Anyway, I needed to go for a pee, and I can't pee around people, so I usually go quite far from the group so I can have peace. I went right down to the plain at the edge of my woods. I was standing there, just peeing, thinking, imagine if someone was walking by and just looked over and seen me pissing. And I shit you not, out of nowhere, this person walking on the other side of the woods walks right past me. I saw them from the side and was like, holy shit, who's that? They were wearing a black hoodie. I had no idea who they were or how they got there or why the hell they were walking through. The direction they were going in is nothing but woods for miles. I was sober at the time, only had about 1 or 2 pints, so I saw what I saw. It was only about 5 p.m. in the summertime, so the sun was still shining. Where we set up camp, you can see the walkway into the woods, so if anyone comes in or out, they pass through there. I never saw that person again, and I watched carefully. I was very afraid to go for a pee that night.